Rich teen mercilessly humiliates her poor classmate. But when a school project exposes his heartbreaking reality, she's forced to confront her own cruelty. Sophie strutted down the halls of Fairview Academy with the confidence of someone who knew she was admired. Her hair was perfectly styled, and her designer handbag hung casually on her arm. She was the kind of girl who always had an entourage, a group of followers who echoed her every laugh and mimicked her every move. But for all her popularity, Sophie had a mean streak. She took pleasure in finding the weak spots in others, exploiting them to elevate her own status. Today, her eyes were set on Ben, the quiet boy who sat alone at the back of the class. Ben's worn-out sneakers and faded hoodie stood out in a school full of students wearing the latest trends. Sophie noticed the hole in the elbow of his sweater and smirked. She made her way over to him, her group trailing behind like obedient shadows. "Nice sweater, Ben," she sneered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Did you get that at a yard sale or something?" The other students laughed, their laughter sharp and mocking. Ben didn't respond. He kept his head down, his fingers tightening around the straps of his backpack. Sophie's words stung, but he was used to it by now. Every day was a new insult, a new reminder that he didn't belong. As Sophie walked away, a sense of satisfaction washed over her. It felt good to be on top, to remind everyone of their place, especially someone like Ben. He was an easy target, and she never tired of making him feel small. She didn't understand why he never fought back, never tried to defend himself. It just made him more pathetic in her eyes. But what Sophie didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was the weight Ben carried on his shoulders. His mother's illness had drained their finances, leaving little room for anything beyond the basic necessities. Every penny went towards her medication, leaving Ben with nothing but hand-me-downs and second-hand items. Ben took a deep breath as he walked to his next class, trying to shake off the encounter. He couldn't afford to dwell on Sophie's cruelty. There were more important things to focus on, like getting through the school day and then rushing home to take care of his mom. She had been his rock for so long, and now it was his turn to be hers. But the constant teasing was starting to wear him down. He was tired, both physically and emotionally, and some days it felt like too much to bear. Still, he kept his head down and pushed through, determined to make it to the end of the day without breaking. Sophie's friends, energized by her attack on Ben, continued to gossip as they walked down the hall. "Can you believe he even bothers showing up to school dressed like that?" one of them said, her voice full of disdain. "I mean, it's not like he's going to make anything of himself." Sophie laughed, but there was a slight edge to it now, as if something about the conversation was starting to feel off. But she quickly shook the feeling away. After all, it wasn't her problem. Ben's life had nothing to do with hers, and she wasn't about to let his misery ruin her day. The bell rang and the students scattered to their classes. Ben found his seat in the back corner, grateful for the temporary reprieve from Sophie's taunts. He pulled out his notebook, trying to focus on the lesson ahead, but his mind kept drifting back to his mother, to the endless cycle of doctor visits and medications that never seemed to make her better. He wished he could do more for her, but he was just a kid, and there were limits to what he could handle on his own. As he scribbled notes, his thoughts were a million miles away, in a small, cramped apartment where the woman who had once been his hero was now fading away before his eyes. Meanwhile, Sophie sat in the front row, barely paying attention to the teacher. Her thoughts drifted back to Ben, but this time it wasn't with the same satisfaction as before. There was something about the look in his eyes, the way he never fought back, that gnawed at her. But she quickly dismissed it, focusing instead on her weekend plans and the party she was throwing. Life was too short to worry about someone like Ben. She had her own life to live, one filled with luxury, comfort, and the adoration of her peers. Sophie couldn't believe her bad luck, when Mrs. Reynolds paired her with Ben for the history project. The class had just finished discussing the assignment, researching and presenting on a significant event from the last century, and Sophie had been confident she would partner with one of her friends. But when the teacher read out the pairs, her name was followed by Ben's, and a ripple of surprise ran through the room. Sophie's eyes widened in disbelief, her usual cool demeanor slipping for a moment. Her friends exchanged glances, holding back snickers, while Sophie slumped in her chair, seething with frustration. "Why me?" she muttered as the bell rang, gathering her things with more force than necessary. Her friends trailed behind her, eager to hear her reaction. "I mean, can you imagine going to his house? I bet it's like falling apart," she continued, rolling her eyes dramatically. The others giggled, but there was an unease in their laughter. They knew Sophie could be cruel, but even they felt a twinge of discomfort at the idea of ridiculing someone's home. Sophie, however, was too wrapped up in her own annoyance to notice. To her, this project was nothing more than a tedious chore, and being paired with Ben made it that much worse. Ben, on the other hand, took the news in stride. He had long grown used to life throwing him curveballs, and this was just another one to handle. As he gathered his books, he glanced at Sophie, who was still fuming. He didn't expect her to contribute much to the project. He was ready to do most of the work himself if it meant getting through it without a confrontation. He had enough to worry about without adding Sophie's attitude to the mix. But there was a small part of him, buried deep under layers of exhaustion and stress, that hoped she might surprise him. Perhaps once they were away from the school, things would be different. The day of the visit came, and Sophie found herself dragging her feet as she made her way to Ben's neighborhood. She had never ventured this far from her own part of town, and the change in scenery was jarring. Gone were the manicured lawns and sprawling houses she was used to. Instead, the streets were lined with small, aging homes, many of which looked like they hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in years. The sidewalks were cracked, and weeds pushed through the gaps. Sophie's discomfort grew with every step, her usual air of confidence slowly evaporating. For the first time, she felt out of place, unsure of herself in a way that was entirely unfamiliar. When she finally reached Ben's house, she stopped short, her mouth going dry. The house was small, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. The front yard was overgrown, and the porch looked like it hadn't been used in years. Sophie hesitated, her hand hovering above the door before she finally knocked. The sound of the door creaking open sent a shiver down her spine, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of doubt. What was she getting herself into? The carefree girl who had mocked Ben so easily in school was suddenly faced with a reality she had never considered, and it left her feeling unsteady. The door opened to reveal Ben, who greeted her with a polite nod. "Come in," he said quietly, stepping aside to let her enter. Sophie hesitated, glancing around as if hoping for an excuse to leave, but there was none. She stepped inside, immediately struck by the stark contrast between her own home and Ben's. The inside of the house was dimly lit, the furniture worn and simple. There was no trace of the luxury she was accustomed to, no designer decor, no flat-screen TV. Instead, there was a quiet, almost oppressive stillness in the air. Sophie felt out of place, her discomfort growing as she took in her surroundings. As they sat down at the kitchen table to begin their work, Sophie found herself struggling to focus. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint sounds of a clock ticking on the wall. Ben seemed unfazed, his attention on the notes he had laid out in front of him. But Sophie couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in her chest. The walls around her felt too close, the room too small. She couldn't understand how Ben lived like this, day after day. For the first time, she realized how little she knew about him, and the thought made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't quite explain. Ben's face remained impassive as he opened the door, offering Sophie a brief nod before stepping aside to let her in. Sophie hesitated on the threshold, still feeling out of her element. But as she crossed into the living room, she was surprised by what she saw. The room was modest, but meticulously kept. The kind of place where every item had a purpose and a place. The furniture was old but clean, and the walls were decorated with simple, homely touches. A faded but soft-looking rug lay on the floor, and a small bookshelf stood in the corner, its shelves filled with well-worn books. There was a subtle warmth to the space that she hadn't expected, a feeling of care and attention that caught her off guard. Ben led her through the living room to the kitchen, moving with a quiet confidence that Sophie couldn't help but notice. He moved like someone used to taking care of things, his actions purposeful and precise. Sophie followed him, trying not to stare too much, but she found herself intrigued. This wasn't the chaotic, depressing environment she had imagined. It was far from the luxury she was used to, but it was a home, and one that was clearly cared for. As they reached the kitchen, Sophie took in the space. It was small, with old appliances and a round wooden table in the center. The countertops were clean, and a pot of something fragrant simmered on the stove, filling the room with a comforting aroma. They sat down at the table, and Sophie pulled out her notebook, ready to dive into the project. But as she did, her eyes wandered to the walls, where a series of framed photos caught her attention. She saw pictures of Ben as a little boy, his face bright with a wide smile, his eyes full of innocence and joy. In one photo, he stood next to a woman who was clearly his mother. They were both grinning, their faces close together, radiating happiness. The woman looked so full of life, her eyes sparkling with the same light that Sophie had once seen in Ben's. It was a stark contrast to the muted atmosphere of the house, and Sophie felt a strange pang in her chest that she couldn't quite identify. Sophie glanced back at Ben, who was now focused on the project, his expression as guarded as ever. The lively boy in the photos seemed worlds apart from the quiet, reserved person sitting across from her. She couldn't help but wonder what had happened to change him so much, to dim the light in his eyes. But she quickly pushed the thoughts away, reminding herself that she was here for a school project, not to satisfy her curiosity. Still, the image of that photo lingered in her mind, and she found it hard to concentrate as she began to jot down notes for their assignment. Ben, meanwhile, was absorbed in the work, his mind focused on the task at hand. He was aware of Sophie's eyes on him, but he didn't look up. He had seen the way she reacted to his home, the subtle shift in her demeanor as she took in her surroundings. He was used to people judging him, but there was something different about Sophie's reaction. It wasn't the usual pity or disdain. It was something else, something he couldn't quite place. It made him uneasy, but he kept his face neutral, not wanting to give anything away. He was determined to get through this project without letting Sophie's presence disrupt his life any more than it already had. As they worked, the silence between them was thick, filled with unspoken thoughts and questions. Sophie found herself sneaking glances at Ben, trying to decipher the boy who seemed so different from the one she had imagined. She noticed how he kept everything in order, how his hands moved with precision as he wrote. There was a calmness about him, a quiet strength that she hadn't noticed before. It was unsettling, making her feel even more out of place. She had expected to feel superior, but instead she felt a growing unease, as if she was the one who didn't belong. The afternoon wore on, the room filled with the sound of pens scratching on paper and the occasional rustle of pages. Sophie's mind kept drifting back to that photo, to the woman with the bright smile and the boy who looked so different from the Ben she knew now. She wanted to ask about her, about what had changed, but she didn't know how to breach the subject. Instead, she buried herself in the project, trying to push the thoughts away. But no matter how hard she tried, the questions lingered, making her feel more unsettled with each passing minute. As Sophie and Ben worked through their project, the silence between them was only occasionally broken by the sound of papers shuffling or the scratch of a pen. Sophie was deep in thought, her mind still wrestling with the image of Ben's life that had slowly begun to take shape in her mind. She had been so focused on her own world, her own worries, that she had never really considered what might be going on in Ben's life. The realization made her feel uncomfortable, as if she were seeing him for the first time, but she wasn't sure how to process it. A soft cough from down the hall interrupted the quiet, a sound so faint that Sophie almost missed it. But Ben's reaction was immediate. His pen paused mid-sentence, and without a word, he stood up and excused himself, disappearing quickly down the hallway. Sophie was left alone, the silence suddenly feeling heavier without him there. She sat awkwardly, her eyes wandering around the kitchen as she tried to ignore the unease settling in her chest. The murmured conversation between Ben and his mother was just audible, their voices a soft, indistinct hum that only deepened her curiosity. Sophie strained to catch bits of the conversation, but all she could make out was the tenderness in Ben's tone and the frail reply of his mother. The realization hit her with a quiet but powerful force. Ben's mother was sick, much more so than she had imagined. The thought unsettled her, not just because she hadn't considered it before, but because it was so far removed from anything she had ever had to deal with. The walls of the small house seemed to close in around her, and for a moment, she felt completely out of her depth. This was a world she knew nothing about, a reality she had never had to face. When Ben returned, his expression was calm, but Sophie noticed the slight furrow in his brow, the flicker of worry in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He apologized quietly for the interruption, his voice steady, though it lacked the usual guardedness she had come to expect from him. Sophie nodded, but the words she wanted to say seemed to stick in her throat. She wasn't sure how to respond. What could she possibly say that wouldn't sound hollow or insincere? So she said nothing, opting instead to focus back on the project, though her thoughts were far from the history assignment in front of her. As they continued to work, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. The air felt different, charged with an unspoken understanding that hadn't been there before. She kept stealing glances at Ben, noticing things she hadn't before. The way his jaw tightened when he was concentrating, the lines of stress that seemed too deep for someone his age. For the first time, she saw him as more than just the quiet kid with the worn-out clothes. He was someone who carried a weight she couldn't begin to imagine. Someone who had been enduring far more than she had ever realized. The echoes of her earlier mocking remarks reverberated in her mind, now tainted with regret. Every cruel word she had thrown at him felt like a heavy stone in her stomach, and she couldn't ignore the gnawing guilt that had begun to take root. Sophie had always prided herself on being sharp and witty, but now those same traits seemed mean and shallow in the face of what Ben was dealing with. She wanted to apologize, to say something that would acknowledge the weight of her actions, but she didn't know where to begin. The words seemed too big, too complicated, and so she stayed silent, unsure of how to bridge the gap she had created. The remainder of their time together was spent in near silence, but it was a different kind of quiet now, one that was thick with unspoken words and new realizations. Sophie's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one colliding with the next, as she tried to reconcile the person she had thought Ben was with the person she now saw in front of her. It was a difficult shift, and it left her feeling off balance, unsure of herself in a way she hadn't experienced before. The project that had seemed so simple and straightforward now felt like a lifeline, something to focus on as she tried to navigate the complexities of her own emotions. The days seemed to blur together after Sophie's first visit to Ben's home. The images of the small, tidy house and the faint sound of his mother's cough lingered in her mind, disrupting her usual thoughts. Each time she caught herself daydreaming, her mind would wander back to that dimly lit kitchen, the photos on the wall, and the quiet, resilient boy she had come to see in a new light. The history project was almost complete, and Sophie knew she had to return to Ben's house one last time. But this time, the thought of going back didn't fill her with the same dread. She convinced herself that her eagerness to finish the project was the only reason, but deep down, she knew there was more to it. When Sophie arrived at Ben's house, the familiar sight of the worn exterior didn't feel as foreign as before. She knocked on the door with less hesitation, and when Ben opened it, she noticed a subtle change in him. His usual guarded expression was still there, but his eyes seemed a bit softer, as if the barrier between them had thinned. "Hey," he said simply, stepping aside to let her in. Sophie returned the greeting, offering a small smile as she entered the house. The warmth she had noticed on her first visit was still there, wrapping around her like a blanket, making the space feel strangely comforting. They settled down at the kitchen table, and for a while they worked in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The project was almost done, just a few finishing touches left. But as they worked, Sophie found herself glancing at Ben, curious about the world he had let her glimpse. She noticed how his fingers moved with practiced ease, flipping through pages of notes, and how his brow furrowed in concentration. There was a calmness to him that she hadn't seen before, a quiet strength that made her wonder how much he had gone through to build it. The more she observed, the more she realized how little she truly knew about him, and that realization stirred something deep inside her. After a while, Ben stood up and walked over to the kettle, filling it with water. "Would you like some tea?" he asked, his voice soft but clear. Sophie blinked in surprise, not expecting the offer, but she nodded. "Sure, that would be nice," she replied, watching as Ben moved about the small kitchen with ease. She noticed how he seemed to know exactly where everything was, how he moved with the same efficiency she had seen in his actions before. As he poured the tea into mismatched mugs, Sophie felt the urge to break the silence that had settled between them, to ask the question that had been on her mind since her first visit. They sat at the table, the steam from the tea curling up between them, creating a small, intimate space. Sophie wrapped her hands around the warm mug, gathering her courage. "Ben," she started, her voice hesitant, I noticed your mom isn't well. I heard her coughing last time, and I guess I just wanted to ask if she's okay." Her words hung in the air, awkward and unsure, but she couldn't hold them back any longer. Ben's hands stilled on his mug, and for a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. But then he sighed, the sound heavy with a weight she couldn't quite fathom. She's been sick for a while now," Ben said slowly, his eyes focused on the tea in front of him. "It's a rare illness. The doctors say it's something that most people don't get, but when they do, it's bad." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "We can't afford the best treatment. The insurance only covers so much, and the bills just keep piling up." His voice was steady, but Sophie could hear the strain behind it, the effort it took to keep the emotions at bay. She felt a pang of guilt, realizing how much she had taken for granted in her own life, how easy it had been to mock someone whose struggles she hadn't even tried to understand. Sophie didn't know what to say, so she stayed silent, letting Ben's words settle in. She could see the toll it had taken on him, the way his shoulders hunched slightly, the dark circles under his eyes. He was just a kid like her, but he had been forced to carry so much more. The realization was sobering, and it made her feel small, her previous judgments now seeming shallow and cruel. As they sipped their tea in the quiet kitchen, Sophie found herself wanting to say something, anything that might offer comfort. But the words wouldn't come, so she simply listened, hoping that, in some small way, it was enough. As the days went by, Sophie found herself thinking more and more about Ben and the life he led. The image of him quietly caring for his sick mother, balancing schoolwork, and shouldering responsibilities that seemed far too heavy for someone their age, lingered in her mind. She saw Ben in a new light, no longer as the shy boy with shabby clothes, but as someone resilient, someone strong beyond his years. The more she learned, the more she respected him, admiring the quiet determination he showed every day. Sophie started to wonder how she could help, though the answer wasn't immediately clear. It wasn't about charity. It was about doing something meaningful, something that acknowledged the struggles Ben faced. This shift in Sophie's perspective began to manifest in her actions. At school, she no longer found amusement in mocking Ben, nor did she stand by silently when others did. One day, when she overheard a group of students snickering about Ben's worn-out shoes, she couldn't stay quiet. "You guys don't even know what he's dealing with," she snapped, her tone sharp enough to make them blink in surprise. "Maybe you should worry about your own lives instead of picking on someone who's going through more than you can imagine." The silence that followed was thick, and though her friends exchanged confused glances, no one dared to challenge her. For the first time, Sophie felt like she was standing up for something that truly mattered, and it filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't known she needed. Her friends, used to Sophie's biting humor and carefree attitude, were baffled by the change. They tried to laugh it off, chalking it up to some temporary mood, but Sophie didn't join in. The more they pushed, the more she realized how shallow their interactions had been. Conversations that once seemed fun now felt empty, and the things that used to entertain her seemed trivial. Sophie found herself drifting away from the group, not because she wanted to isolate herself, but because she was changing in ways they didn't understand. And for the first time, she didn't care about being misunderstood. There were bigger things to worry about, and she was beginning to understand what really mattered. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was undeniable. Sophie began to focus more on her studies, realizing that education was not just a means to pass the time, but a tool to better understand the world and her place in it. She started volunteering for activities she had previously dismissed as boring or unnecessary, like tutoring younger students or helping with charity drives. Each small act of kindness felt like a step towards something greater, a way to make up for the years she had spent looking down on others. And every time she thought of Ben, it strengthened her resolve to continue on this path, even if it meant leaving her old self behind. At home, Sophie's parents noticed the change too. They weren't sure what had sparked it, but they were pleased to see their daughter becoming more thoughtful and considerate. She no longer complained about trivial things, and her requests for new clothes or gadgets became rare. Instead, Sophie started asking about ways to get involved in community work or how they could help families in need. Her parents, impressed and somewhat taken aback, encouraged her, proud of the maturity she was beginning to show. What they didn't know was that Sophie's transformation had been fueled by her experiences with Ben, by the realization that life was about more than just comfort and luxury. Sophie's newfound sense of purpose filled her with a kind of quiet happiness she hadn't known before. She felt lighter, more in control of her life, and more connected to the people around her. The petty dramas that used to consume her now seemed insignificant. Instead, she found joy in doing things for others, in making a real difference, even if it was in small ways. Each day brought a new challenge, But instead of shying away, she faced them head-on, determined to be the person she was meant to be. And every day, she found herself thinking of Ben, wondering if there was more she could do to help him, to ease the burden he carried so silently. At school, the changes in Sophie were impossible to ignore. She no longer played the role of the aloof, popular girl who thrived on mocking others. Her actions spoke louder than any words could, and soon the whispers began. Some people were critical, calling her a traitor for defending Ben, while others were simply confused, trying to figure out what had happened to the Sophie they thought they knew. But Sophie didn't let their opinions sway her. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was on the right path, and that was enough. The world seemed a little clearer now, and Sophie was determined to keep moving forward, no matter what others thought. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to do something more than just change her own behavior. The thought of Ben and his mother's situation weighed heavily on her, pushing her to take action. One afternoon, she decided to go straight to the school principal, Mrs. Donovan, with an idea that had been forming in her mind for days. She waited outside the office, nerves twisting in her stomach, but she knew she couldn't back out now. When Mrs. Donovan finally called her in, Sophie took a deep breath and launched into her proposal. A school-wide fundraiser aimed at helping families in need, specifically mentioning Ben's situation without revealing too much personal detail. Mrs. Donovan listened carefully, her expression unreadable at first. "You've never been one to get involved in these kinds of activities before, Sophie," she noted, her tone mildly curious. "What's changed?" Sophie hesitated, but then she met the principal's gaze with determination. "I've realized that we can do more as a school, that we should be helping each other when times are tough. This fundraiser could really make a difference for families who are struggling, like Ben's." Mrs. Donovan raised an eyebrow, impressed by Sophie's sincerity. "It's a big undertaking," she said slowly, "but your passion is evident. Let's give it a try." With those words, Sophie felt a surge of excitement. She had convinced the principal, and now she was ready to put her plan into action. Sophie dove into the project head first, channeling all her energy into making the fundraiser a success. She used her social connections, rallying her classmates, and even reaching out to teachers she had barely spoken to before. To her surprise, many of them were eager to help, offering their time and resources to ensure the fundraiser would be impactful. Her friends, who had been puzzled by her recent changes, began to see the depth of her commitment and joined in as well, albeit with lingering curiosity about her newfound dedication. The school buzzed with talk of the upcoming event, and soon enough, everyone was involved. Whether it was baking goods, organizing a talent show, or setting up booths for a school fair. As the fundraiser gained momentum, Sophie found herself juggling more tasks than she had ever imagined. She coordinated with local businesses to secure donations, organized volunteers, and even managed the logistics of the events they planned to host. Each day was a whirlwind, but Sophie felt a sense of purpose that kept her going. She saw how people were coming together, excited to contribute to something bigger than themselves. The school halls, once filled with casual chatter about weekend plans and social media, were now buzzing with discussions about the fundraiser. Sophie couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as she watched her peers unite for a common cause. At first, Ben was reluctant to accept the help. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of charity and didn't want to feel like a burden. When Sophie approached him to talk about the fundraiser, he was hesitant, his usual reserved nature showing. "I don't want people to feel sorry for us," he said quietly, his gaze downcast. Sophie shook her head, her voice firm but kind. "This isn't about pity, Ben. It's about the community coming together. There are other families who need help too. You're not alone in this." Her words seemed to reach him, and after a moment, he nodded. "Okay," he agreed softly, though the uncertainty in his eyes remained. Sophie smiled, feeling a mix of relief and determination. She knew it wasn't easy for him, but she was determined to show him that the school cared. As the date of the fundraiser drew closer, the excitement in the school grew. Posters decorated the hallways, and announcements were made during every assembly. The sheer scale of the event was beyond anything Sophie had imagined when she first pitched the idea. Students were rehearsing for the talent show, teachers were planning their contributions, and the local community began to take notice as well. Sophie found herself both nervous and exhilarated, hoping they could raise enough money to make a real difference for the families who needed it most. Every spare moment was spent fine-tuning details, making sure nothing was overlooked. The night before the event, Sophie stayed late at the school, double-checking everything. The gym had been transformed into a vibrant space filled with booths and decorations, and the auditorium was ready for performances. As she walked through the empty hallways, Sophie felt a wave of emotions: pride in what they had accomplished, hope for what the fundraiser could achieve, and a deep sense of responsibility. This was more than just a school project or a personal mission. It was a chance to change lives. And as she locked up and headed home, Sophie knew that no matter the outcome, she had already made a difference by bringing people together for a cause that truly mattered. The day of the fundraiser dawned bright and clear, a perfect backdrop for the event that had taken weeks of planning and effort. By the time Sophie arrived at the school, the gym was already buzzing with activity. Volunteers were setting up booths, arranging tables covered in baked goods, crafts, and silent auction items. The space, usually reserved for basketball games and pep rallies, had been transformed into a vibrant marketplace. Colorful banners hung from the rafters, and the air was filled with the hum of excited chatter. Sophie took a moment to take it all in, feeling a rush of pride and anticipation. She had never imagined it would come together like this, but now, seeing it with her own eyes, she felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. As the morning turned into afternoon, the gym filled with students, parents, and members of the community. The turnout was beyond anything Sophie had hoped for. Everywhere she looked, people were engaged, laughing, and participating in the activities she had helped organize. The booths were surrounded by eager kids trying their luck at games, while parents browsed the auction items or chatted over cups of hot cocoa. Sophie made her way through the crowd, stopping to check in with volunteers and ensure everything was running smoothly. With each donation that came in, she felt a surge of happiness, knowing that the money would go directly to those who needed it most. The sense of community was tangible, a warm, unifying force that seemed to envelop everyone present. By midday, the gym was packed to capacity, the noise level rising as more people arrived. Sophie found herself running from one end of the gym to the other, making sure nothing was overlooked. Despite the hectic pace, she couldn't stop smiling. Every time she saw a familiar face, they greeted her with words of encouragement and praise for the event. It was a far cry from the typical school day, where the focus was on tests and social hierarchies. Here, everyone was on equal footing, united by a common cause. Sophie realized that this was what she had been searching for, a way to connect with others that went beyond superficial interactions, something meaningful that made a real difference. As the hours passed, the donation boxes began to fill up, the totals exceeding even the most optimistic estimates. Sophie watched in awe as the numbers climbed, each contribution a testament to the power of coming together. The energy in the room was infectious, and she could see the impact the event was having on everyone involved. Even those who had been skeptical at first were now fully invested, caught up in the spirit of generosity and community. Sophie knew that this was more than just a fundraiser. It was a turning point, not just for her, but for the entire school. It was proof that when people united for a cause, they could achieve something extraordinary. As the evening drew to a close, the gym began to empty, the excitement gradually giving way to a quieter, more reflective atmosphere. Sophie, exhausted but exhilarated, finally allowed herself a moment to rest. She scanned the room, her heart swelling with pride at the sight of the volunteers cleaning up, the last few attendees lingering to chat or make final bids in the auction. It was then that she spotted Ben, standing near the entrance, watching the scene unfold with a look of quiet amazement. He had been there all day, helping out wherever he could, but always staying on the sidelines, never seeking the spotlight. Sophie made her way over to him, weaving through the remaining clusters of people. When Ben saw Sophie approaching, he offered her a small, genuine smile. "This is incredible," he said softly, his voice filled with awe. "I can't believe how many people showed up." Sophie nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat as she looked at him. "I couldn't have done it without you," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so glad you were here." For a moment, they stood there in silence, just taking it all in. The noise of the crowd faded into the background, and Sophie felt an overwhelming sense of connection with Ben. The journey they had been on, from that first awkward meeting to this moment of shared triumph, had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Sophie could hardly believe how much had shifted in such a short time. She thought back to the girl she had been just a few weeks ago, arrogant, dismissive, focused only on herself. Now, standing next to Ben, she realized how far she had come. Her heart swelled with respect for him, not just for what he had endured, but for the way he had quietly persevered, never asking for anything, yet giving so much. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly. "For everything." Ben looked at her, his eyes reflecting a depth of gratitude and understanding that words couldn't capture. "No," he said softly, shaking his head. "Thank you, Sophie." And in that moment, as they stood side by side, they both knew that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The success of the fundraiser marked a turning point in both Sophie's and Ben's lives. The money raised was more than anyone had anticipated, and it made a real difference. Ben's mother, who had been struggling with the mounting medical bills, now had access to better care, easing the financial burden that had weighed so heavily on them. The community's support did more than just provide funds. It brought a renewed sense of hope to their small family. Seeing the compassion and generosity from so many people seemed to give Ben's mother a much-needed lift in spirit, though her illness was still a constant battle. The small signs of improvement she began to show filled Ben with a cautious optimism he hadn't felt in a long time. Sophie's parents, who had initially been skeptical about her sudden interest in helping others, couldn't hide their pride as they saw the impact she had made. They had watched their daughter transform from someone who had once been focused solely on herself to a young woman who was genuinely invested in making a difference. At dinner one evening, her father put down his fork and looked at her with admiration. "You've done something incredible, Sophie. We're so proud of you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. Sophie smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest. She knew that her parents' approval meant a lot, but what mattered more was the change she felt inside, the sense that she was finally doing something meaningful with her life. Despite the success of the fundraiser, Sophie didn't see it as the end of her journey. Instead, it was just the beginning. She had discovered a passion for advocacy that she hadn't known existed within her. Sophie began to throw herself into more projects aimed at helping those in need, using the skills and connections she had honed during the fundraiser to make a broader impact. She started working with local charities, organizing drives for food, clothing, and school supplies. Each new project deepened her commitment to giving back, and she found herself growing more fulfilled with every step she took. Meanwhile, Sophie's relationship with Ben blossomed into a true friendship. The bond they had formed during the fundraiser only grew stronger as they spent more time together. Sophie admired Ben's quiet resilience, his ability to carry so much on his shoulders without complaint. In turn, Ben respected Sophie's newfound determination and the way she used her privilege to uplift others. They began to hang out outside of school, often meeting up at the small park near Ben's house where they would talk for hours about everything from their hopes for the future to the challenges they faced. Their conversations were easy, filled with the kind of trust and understanding that only true friends share. One day, as they sat on a bench in the park, Sophie turned to Ben with a thoughtful expression. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about what you said, that accepting help isn't a sign of weakness," she began, her voice reflective. "I think I'm finally starting to understand that. It's not about being strong on your own. It's about being strong enough to let others in, to let them care." Ben nodded, a slight smile playing on his lips. "It took me a while to get there too," he admitted, "but I'm glad I did. It's made things easier, knowing I don't have to do it all alone." Sophie reached over and squeezed his hand, a gesture of solidarity. In that moment, they both knew that their friendship had become something rare and invaluable. As the weeks passed, the impact of the fundraiser continued to ripple through their community. Other students were inspired by Sophie and Ben's efforts, and soon the school was buzzing with new ideas for how they could help those in need. Sophie found herself at the center of this movement, encouraging her peers to get involved and showing them how powerful they could be when they worked together. The change in the school's atmosphere was palpable. What had once been a place where popularity and appearances reigned now felt more like a community, with students looking out for one another in ways they hadn't before. Sophie and Ben's friendship became a symbol of this newfound spirit of compassion. Their bond showed that true connections are built on understanding and empathy, not superficial judgments. As they walked through the school hallways, students would smile and nod, a silent acknowledgement of the respect they had earned. Sophie no longer cared about being at the top of the social hierarchy. She had found something far more valuable. And as for Ben, he had learned that accepting help didn't make him any less strong. In fact, it made him stronger, because it allowed him to stand with others instead of alone. Together, they had shown their school what it truly meant to care. As the final days of the school year slipped away, Sophie often found herself reflecting on how much her life had transformed. The things that had once seemed so important, designer clothes, social status, and being part of the popular crowd, now felt distant and insignificant. What had started with a school project and an unexpected partnership had blossomed into a profound personal change. Sophie had found a new sense of purpose in helping others, and it brought her a deeper joy than any material possession ever could. The fundraiser had sparked something within her, and she was determined to keep that flame burning. She had already begun planning new initiatives, each one inspired by the quiet strength she had witnessed in Ben and the resilience of his family. In those reflective moments, Sophie realized that her journey had only just begun. She had learned that true wealth wasn't about what you owned, but about what you gave. And she wanted to give back, to continue making a difference in her community. The fulfillment she felt was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was no longer about filling her life with things, but with meaningful actions that could change lives. Sophie knew that this was where she was meant to be, using her voice and resources to uplift others, guided by the lessons she had learned from Ben and his family. Ben's life had also been irrevocably changed by the events of the past year. With the money raised from the fundraiser, his mother's health had shown signs of improvement, bringing a sense of relief and hope that had been absent for so long. The once overwhelming weight on Ben's shoulders had lightened, not just because of the financial support, but because he now knew he wasn't alone. The community had rallied around him, showing him that there were people who cared, who were willing to stand by him in his darkest hours. It was a realization that had reshaped his understanding of strength. It wasn't about enduring everything by himself, but about allowing others to help carry the load. As graduation day approached, the school was buzzing with excitement and anticipation. The ceremony was held in the same gym that had been transformed for the fundraiser months earlier. Now, it was decorated with banners and flowers, the bleachers packed with proud families and friends. Sophie sat among her classmates, the cap and gown feeling both strange and symbolic, a representation of the person she had become over the course of the year. When her name was called, she walked across the stage with a sense of accomplishment that went far beyond academics. This moment wasn't just about graduating from high school. It was about the growth she had experienced, the person she had become. When it was Ben's turn to walk across the stage, the room filled with applause. Sophie watched him, her heart swelling with pride. Ben had endured so much, but he had done so with grace and quiet determination. As their eyes met, they shared a glance that conveyed more than words ever could. They had started out as strangers, then unwilling partners, and finally, as true friends. Their journey had been one of discovery, not just of each other, but of themselves. Through Ben, Sophie had learned what it truly meant to be strong. And through Sophie, Ben had seen the power of compassion and community. After the ceremony, as the graduates mingled with their families and friends, Sophie and Ben found a moment to stand together, looking out over the crowd. "We did it," Sophie said, a soft smile playing on her lips. Ben nodded, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. "Yeah, we did." There was a calm between them, a mutual understanding that didn't need to be spoken. They had both come so far, and they knew that their journey was far from over. The world ahead was filled with possibilities, and they were ready to face it, knowing they had the strength to make a difference. As they left the gym, the sun setting on the last day of their high school years, Sophie felt a deep sense of peace. She had found her path, one that wasn't defined by wealth or status, but by the impact she could have on the lives of others. And she knew that Ben would continue to inspire her, just as she hoped she had inspired him. Together, they had learned the true meaning of wealth, kindness, empathy, and the willingness to stand by each other, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Now, how about another one? To watch another nice story, just click on the video appearing on your screen.